The bustling subway platform was filled with the usual bustle. People were rushing to work. Teenagers were chatting on their phones, and pensioners, bent under the weight of their bags, were hurrying to take their seats. In the center of this seemingly ordinary picture, a figure appeared whose presence would soon destroy the fragile balance. He stood by the pole, wearing a worn leather jacket and faded jeans. His eyes darted around the platform until they landed on an older woman. She was a black pensioner, thin and carrying a small bag. She looked tired, as if her day had begun long before dawn. The woman stood waiting for the train, holding on to the handrail. Her gaze was calm, but her neighbor's discreetly assessing gaze gave away her intentions. It was Bill, a middle-aged white man, as worn out by life as his faded jacket. He didn't need the money. He wasn't going to spend it on anything important. He didn't even have anything to prove. He did it simply because he could, simply because he saw her, a black pensioner, as an outsider in this place. They always take everything, he thought, looking at her with disdain. The unfair thing is that now they think they're our equals. As the train pulled up to the platform and the doors hissed open, Bill moved closer to the woman, his movements fast and practiced. He waited until she took a step inside, then abruptly snatched the bag from her hands. It was an instant. The pensioner screamed, her cry breaking through the noisy metro, but Bill had already darted back, disappearing into the crowd. "What are you doing?" the woman screamed, her voice shaking with surprise and hurt. She tried to grab the handrail to keep from falling, and tears came to her eyes. "What did you expect?" Bill muttered under his breath, already clutching her bag in his hand. His face was coldly indifferent. Consider it a debt repaid. His debt was imaginary. His mind was filled with stereotypes and anger that he had been building up for years. Bill saw himself as a victim of the fact that his life had turned out far from what he wanted. He blamed others, not himself. In his eyes, this woman was part of the problem, part of the outsiders who supposedly took everything he could have had from him. On the platform, several people turned to look. Someone saw him grab the bag, but no one moved. Several passengers quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. A white man in a suit standing nearby frowned, but only stepped aside so as not to interface. No one will stand up for her, Bill thought. No one cares about people like her. But he was wrong. At the other end of the platform stood a man who was watching the proceedings closely. His gaze was cold and focused. It was Jason, a famous actor who, despite his public life, knew how to remain calm and unnoticed in the crowd. He saw everything, and his face remained impassive, but in the depths of his eyes, danger was visible. Jason took a step forward, his movements quick and precise. Bill, unaware that his crime had just become the point of no return, was already heading for the exit, but he didn't yet know that he had become the object of attention of a man who would not let this go. Bill walked quickly across the platform, bag in hand. His eyes were focused on the exit, and his mind was spinning with a mixture of rage and self-satisfaction. He could feel his heart beating faster, but it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, fueled by his own convictions. He felt like he had just stolen something from an old woman, had restored justice. But his triumph was short-lived. A voice filled with anger and pain sounded from behind. "Give me back my bag," the woman shouted, her voice shaking but filled with desperate determination. Bill stopped, turned slowly and looked at her, his lips twisting into a grin that was more like a grimace. "Your bag?" he asked mockingly, holding it up like a trophy. "What if I told you it wasn't your bag anymore?" The woman took a few steps forward, but her weak body could barely keep her balance. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she did not look away. "You have no right," she cried, her voice growing louder. "How can you? This is all I have." Bill laughed, his laughter echoing across the platform, causing several passengers to look over their shoulders. "How can I?" he repeated, his voice filled with sarcasm. "And how can you be here? How can you come to our cities, to our neighborhoods, and think that this is yours?" The woman frowned, her face expressing a mixture of pain and bewilderment. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, taking another step forward. "I didn't take anything from you. I'm just living my life." "Living your life?" Bill interrupted, his eyes flashing with disdain. "That's what you all say. Just living my life. You just want equality. But you know what I see. You taking away everything we've built. You think you deserve it just because you scream the loudest." The woman looked at him, not believing her ears. "This is absurd," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "You don't even know me. I know enough, Bill interrupted, taking a step forward. His voice was lower, almost a threatening whisper. You're just like everyone else. You think you can come here and live like us. No, this isn't your world. This is our world. And if I need to remind you of that, I will. Her hands clenched into fists, but she didn't bat down. You're afraid, she said, her voice weak but with a spark of challenge. Afraid, Bill snorted, but a shadow of uncertainty flickered across his face. Ew, you all scream about being afraid when you just need to know your place. You're complaining about a stolen bag. How many times have you stolen from us? Jobs, housing, our respect. This is payback. The woman shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. You don't know what you're saying, she said. I've worked all my life. My husband worked. We never hurt anyone. All we wanted was to live in peace. And you're trying to humiliate us so you can feel better. These words made Bill freeze. Her calm, her steadfastness knocked the ground out from under his feet. He wanted to answer, but he could not think of anything except more anger. You can say whatever you want, he said, his voice quieter but colder, but nothing will change. You will always be behind us, always. He turned to leave, but at that moment, he heard footsteps. Jason, who had been watching the scene, stepped forward, his face impassive but his eyes threatening. I think you've said enough, he said, his voice quiet, but everyone within the platform's radius heard it. Bill turned around, his eyes widening. He hadn't expected anyone to intervene, and he certainly hadn't expected to see who was standing in front of him. Bill frowned when he saw Jason standing in front of him. His body tensed like a cornered animal, but his face still maintained a mask of self-confidence. He looked at Jason with disdain, but inside, anxiety began to creep in. Despite this, he decided not to back down. The idea that he was right, that he was the one defending his own, was still spinning in his head. So what now? He asked coldly, looking at Jason. You're her protector. You think you can intimidate me? Jason took a step forward, his gaze heavy, as if he were pinning Bill to the floor, but instead of answering, he pointed at the woman standing behind him, still trying to get over the shock. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she wasn't crying. She was trying to maintain her dignity, despite everything that had just happened. Give her the bag, Jason said calmly. His voice was quiet, but there was such power in it that everyone on the platform frowned. Bill smirked, trying to hide his growing uncertainty. And if I don't give it to her? He asked, holding up the bag as if it were a prize trophy. You think you can make me? Why are you even sticking up for her? You have to understand how things work. Jason was silent, his gaze cold as ice, but before he could respond, the woman stepped forward, her voice unexpectedly firm. Why are you doing this? She asked, her eyes looking straight at Bill. Why do you hate me so much? I haven't done anything to you. Bill chuckled, his face twisting into a grimace of contempt again. Why, he repeated, his voice growing louder, because you always think you can take whatever you want. How many times have you taken advantage of us? How many times have you taken from us what is rightfully ours? The woman frowned, her face expressing a mixture of pain and incomprehension. You're talking about things I didn't do, she said, her voice shaking but true. It's not my fault that you're in trouble. Not guilty, Bill shouted, his voice echoing across the platform. Of course you'd say that. You always say that. We just want equality. We just want to be respected. And then what happens? You take away jobs. You fill our schools. You tear apart our communities. And now you're standing here, pretending to be the victim. His words hit her like hail. She clasped her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly, but she didn't look away. I've worked all my life, she said quietly. I've never lied to anyone. I've never humiliated anyone. All I want is to live in peace. Peace, Bill shouted again, his face flushed with rage. You think you can live in peace when all your people are destroying our world? This is our city. This is our country. And you will never be equal here. Never. The crowd on the platform began to whisper. Some passengers turned away, not wanting to interface. But there were also those who looked at Bill with disapproval. Although no one dared to speak up, the woman tried to speak again, but Bill interrupted her, his voice growing louder. You think you're better than me, he snapped, his eyes blazing with malice. You think your tears will change anything? No, you'll always be behind. You'll always be on the bottom rung, and I'll remind you of that every time you forget your place. She couldn't hold back the tears. They streamed down her cheeks. but she didn't look away. Her hands clenched into fists. Her breathing became heavy. "You can scream all you want," she said, her voice weak but firm, "but your hatred will not make you stronger." Those words made Bill freeze for a moment. He opened his mouth to respond, but instead he felt Jason's gaze on him. That gaze was cold as ice, and there was no fear or doubt in it. "Are you finished?" Jason asked quietly, his voice quiet but threatening. Bill looked at him, his confidence starting to evaporate. He felt the ground slipping from under his feet, but instead of giving in, he gritted his teeth and said, "It's none of your business." "It's my business now," Jason replied. His words hung in there, filling the entire platform. The people around him frowned, and Bill felt his hands begin to shake. He knew that his control over the situation was crumbling, but this was only the first step to his final downfall. Bill stood across from Jason, his hands clutching the bag as if it were a trophy he refused to let go of. His eyes were a mixture of fury and fear, but he tried to hide the fear behind a mask of glee. The crowd on the platform remained silent, as if paralyzed by an invisible force. People were afraid to interface, afraid to upset the delicate balance that had turned this moment into a silent storm. "You're getting too much on yourself, mate," Bill said, trying to hold on to the last of his confidence. His voice was shaking, but he quickly corrected himself, adding with a smirk, "You think you can stop me just because you look menacing?" Jason didn't answer. His cold gaze was enough of an answer, and Bill was momentarily silent. But then he looked at the woman. She was standing a little behind him, her tear-stained face looking helpless and hurt. Her frail figure seemed even smaller against the growing tension. "There she is, your heroine," Bill chuckled, his voice filling with sarcasm. "She can't even stand up for herself. Why are you sticking up for her? What are you, her bodyguard, or are you just another one of those people who likes to protect the oppressed?" The woman took a step forward, her voice trembling, but she tried to speak. "I'm not asking for protection," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I just want you to understand that you're wrong. We're not taking anything from you. We just want to live like everyone else." "Live like everyone else?" Bill interrupted, his voice loud again, almost shouting. "You always say that, and then you take away everything we built. You think this is your country. This is our country. We built it. We made it great, and you just destroy it." His words echoed across the platform. The woman recoiled, as if Bill's words had hit her harder than a physical attack could. She tried to find the strength to respond, but her voice was choked by the weight of his hatred. Jason, seeing that she couldn't handle it, stepped forward again, his figure standing between Bill and the woman like a shield. "I'm warning you for the last time," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Give her back and leave." But instead of backing down, Bill felt his rage grow, his eyes filled with hatred, and he took a step forward, coming face to face with Jason. "You think you can scare me?" he hissed. "You're one of them. You're just like her. You think you can tell me what's right and what's wrong?" Jason remained silent, but his gaze grew even colder. However, Bill turned back to the woman, ignoring Jason's threat. "And you," he said, pointing his finger at her, "you will never be our equal. You can cry, you can complain, but you will remain in your place, on the bottom rung. You and everyone like you." These words, filled with malice, made the woman stagger. She tried to say something again, but her voice was drowned in a whisper. Her face expressed helplessness. She knew that her words would not stop him. "Enough!" Someone's voice rang out from the crowd. It was a young man standing nearby. He took a step forward, but then stopped, as if frightened by his own impulse. Bill turned around, his eyes glittering with malice. "Another hero?" he asked mockingly. "Come on, everyone stand up for her." But it won't change anything. The crowd frowned again. No one dared to come closer. People looked at the woman with pity, at Bill with contempt, but no one moved. Jason clenched his fists, his gaze becoming even harder. "You crossed a line," he said, his voice quiet but menacing. Bill grinned again. "Crossed the line?" he asked, his voice full of malice. "They cross the line every day. They violate our order, our life, and you protect them? You are as much a traitor as the rest of them." The woman, hearing these words, could no longer hold back her tears. She felt the hatred of this man piercing her like a knife. She tried to maintain her dignity, but Bill did not stop. His words continued to rain down on her like hail, destroying her calm, her defenses. She hung her head, her shoulders shaking, but there was still a sparkle in her eyes. She knew that this moment should not be the end. but she also knew that she did not have the strength to fight now. Bill, seeing her broken state, felt like a winner. "There you go," he said, his voice filled with malice. "You know your place, and you'll stay there." But at that moment Jason stepped forward again. His voice sounded like a blow. "You've already lost. You just haven't realized it yet." These words made Bill freeze. His smugness began to melt away, and a shadow of doubt appeared in his eyes. But he was not ready to give up. Not yet. He took a step back, but still held the bag in his hand. The crowd began to whisper again. The silence that had fallen over the platform began to fill with a hubbub of voices. People began to condemn Bill louder than before, but he ignored them. His gaze returned to the woman, and his lips curled in a final attempt to show his superiority. "You will always be beneath us," he hissed, his voice filled with anger, but also a hint of panic. "Remember that." However, his words no longer had the power he had hoped for. There was a feeling in the air that his control over the situation was fading, and this was only the beginning of his downfall. Bill, feeling the crowd begin to boil, the looks on their faces becoming increasingly judgmental, realized that his control over the situation was crumbling. But instead of retreating, he did what he had been accustomed to doing all his life. He doubled down on his aggression. He needed to restore that fragile balance where he had dominated. He needed to feel strong again, to transcend this moment, to assert his right. His eyes fell back on the woman standing before him. Her shoulders slumped, but her gaze still full of pain and strength. It was this resilience that angered him the most. It seemed to him that she dared to challenge him simply by her existence, by her ability not to crumble under his words. "You stand here like you're somebody," he began, his voice low but clear, as if he wanted every word to cut through the air, filling the space around him. "But you're nobody. Do you think that your tears will make anyone stand up for you? Do you think that anyone in this world looks at you and sees a person?" The woman raised her head, her lips trembling, but she said nothing. "See," he continued, his voice growing louder now, his face twisted into a wicked grin. "Nothing. Your words mean nothing, and neither do you. It's always been this way. This is our land, our cities, our rules. You will never be masters here. Never." "Enough," a voice came from the crowd. It was a young woman, standing a little to the side. She stepped forward, her face full of indignation. "You can't say that." Bill looked at her, his eyes flashing, but he immediately burst out laughing. "Another savior," he said, waving his hand. "You think you can change anything? Are you one of those who thinks your false tolerance will save this world?" The crowd began to whisper louder and louder. People were clearly not on his side, but they were still afraid to take the plunge. Bill saw this, and his anger was fueled by this silence. He turned back to the woman, his tone even more venomous. "Do you know why you'll never amount to anything?" he asked, his voice full of mockery. "Because you don't deserve it. None of you do. You always come along, demanding, talking about equality, but you never do anything. You just drag us down, and I won't let you pretend you're Michael." The woman could no longer hold back her tears. They streamed down her cheeks, but she remained standing. Her small bag was in Bill's hands, but it seemed as if he was holding more than just her things. He was holding her dignity, her voice, her right to be here. "I never thought I'd hear this in my life," she said, her voice shaking but still holding a spark of strength. "My husband, my children, we all worked for this country. We gave it everything we had, and you want to take away our right to even be respected." "Respect?" Bill shouted, his face turning crimson. "You think you deserve my respect? You think anyone here respects you? No, they're pretending. They're pretending you're an equal, but inside, they know the truth. The same truth I know." He raised the bag as if it were proof of his victory. "This is what you deserve," he said, his voice full of malice. "Nothing. You can stand here and cry. You can talk about your contribution, but you won't change anything. You'll stay where you are." At that moment, the crowd began to move. People could no longer watch silently. Jason, who had been standing silently all this time, watching Bill's every word, stepped forward. His figure, strong and determined, stood between Bill and the woman. "Are you finished?" he asked, his voice low but threatening. Bill grinned, but there was a hint of fear in his eyes. "I speak the truth," he said, trying to maintain his confidence, "and I will not back down." "You're not telling the truth," Jason replied, his voice cold. "You're pouring out your hatred because you're afraid." "Afraid?" Bill shouted, his voice growing louder. "I'm not afraid of anything. I'm defending what's mine. I'm defending our country from people like her. You're only protecting your own weakness, Jason said, his gaze piercing. And that's obvious to anyone standing here. The crowd stood still, listening to his words. The woman standing behind Jason looked up. Her tears had stopped flowing, and her gaze had become hard. Bill felt his confidence evaporating. He tried to find the words to regain control, but he knew he was losing it with each passing second. You're just afraid the world is changing, Jason said. But the world is changing, and there's nothing you can do about it. The words echoed across the platform. Bill could say nothing more. His anger, his hatred, all of it seemed empty and powerless now. The crowd, which had been silent before, now looked at him with condemnation. The woman took a step forward, her voice quiet but firm. I'm not afraid of you, and I'll never be afraid again. Bill felt his world crumble. He wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in his throat. He was no longer strong. Now he was just a man who had lost. Bill stood motionless, like a cornered animal. His face turned pale and then flushed, and his eyes darted from one person to another. The crowd, which had been silent a few minutes earlier, now seemed to come alive. The whispers grew louder. The looks grew more and more judgmental, but no one dared to speak out openly. But the roar pressed on Bill like a concrete slab, threatening to crush his fragile sense of superiority. But he still clung to it. Are you all against me? He shouted, his voice full of anger and, now, fear. Of course you're against me, because I'm the only one who speaks the truth. He waved his hand at the woman who now stood behind Jason. Her tears had dried, but her face was still tense, and her eyes were fixed on Bill. There was no hatred in them, but there was a hardness that angered him more than anything. Look at her, he continued, pointing at the woman. She thinks she can't stand here, in my city, in my subway, and pretend like she belongs here. But I see the real her. I know who she is. Who is she? Jason asked sharply, his voice cutting through the roar of the crowd. He took a step forward, and now there was almost no space between him and Bill. Tell us all who she is. Bill frowned. For a moment, confusion flashed in his eyes, but he quickly recovered and blurted out. She's a nobody. She and people like her come here to take everything we have. They destroy our world, and we just let them. Jason didn't flinch. His gaze remained icy, but there was a hint of something more in it now, something Bill couldn't quite place. Do you think you have the right to decide who is this and who isn't here? Jason asked, his voice calm but threatening. I have that right, Bill shouted, his face turning crimson. Because this is my world, this is our country, and they will never be part of it. Never. The crowd around them grew noisier. Some people began to openly criticize Bill, but others remained silent, their faces filled with passive agreement. The woman standing behind Jason took a step forward. We've been here as long as you have, she said, her voice quiet but confident. We're building this world just like you are. You just don't want to see it. You don't build anything. Bill interrupted, his voice becoming a scream again. You only destroy. You think you're important. You mean nothing. Nothing. At that moment, a policeman suddenly descended onto the platform. His uniform gleamed in the dim light, and his steps were quick, purposeful. He came closer, his face serious. What's going on here? He asked, looking around the crowd. Finally, Bill shouted, his voice rising slightly as if he were clinging to this moment as if it were salvation. This man, he pointed at Jason, is threatening me, and she, he nodded toward the woman, is trying to make me look like the villain. The policeman looked at the woman, then at Jason. His face remained impassive, but his eyes were wary. Is this true? He asked, turning to Jason. No, Jason answered calmly. This man attacked her. He stole her bag and uses every chance he gets to humiliate her. The policeman frowned but said nothing. Bill felt his confidence begin to grow again. Do you believe them? He asked, taking a step forward. Look at them. They pretend to be victims. They always do. And then you believe them instead of your own? Bill's words, spoken with such confidence, made the policeman freeze for a moment. The crowd around him fell silent, as if waiting for his next move. But before he could say anything, the woman took another step forward. You have a choice, she said, her voice shaking again, but now with strength. You can believe him and let it continue, or you can see the truth. The policeman looked at her, then back at Bill. At that moment, another figure emerged from the crowd, a man in a suit holding a folder. His face was focused, and his gait was confident. Excuse my intrusion, officers, he said, coming closer. But I am here on behalf of the city council. All eyes turned to him. Bill frowned, his confidence beginning to waver. Who are you? He asked, his voice rough, but with a growing sense of unease. I'm a lawyer, the man replied, and I have evidence that your incident is not the first. The crowd began to buzz again. People began to look at each other, and Bill felt his throat tighten. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice becoming quieter. The man opened the folder and took out several documents. You are accused of a number of cases of hateful behavior and discrimination, and this will not go without consequences. These words, spoken with such certainty, made Bill go silent. His face turned pale and his hands began to shake. He was no longer the center of attention as the strong and loud one. Now he was a hunted man who was beginning to realize that his world was falling apart. Bill, despite the fact that the situation was clearly beginning to turn against him, could not afford to back down. His pride, his hatred that had fueled his confidence for years, would not allow him to admit defeat. He looked at the lawyer, then at the woman, and despair, mixed with rage, flashed in his eyes. His face flushed again, and his voice took on a sharp, almost shrill tone. You all, he began, pointing a finger at the woman and Jason. You all are hypocrites. You think you can come here, into our world, and dictate your terms. You want me to believe that you are victims. The crowd began to roar again, but this time there was more outrage than fear in the sounds. Some people started shouting at Bill, but he ignored them. He couldn't let his voice be drowned out. Look at her, he shouted, pointing at the woman standing just behind Jason. She can't even answer. Why? Because she knows I'm right. She knows everything I say is true. The woman took a step forward, her face a mixture of pain and determination. I don't know anything about you, she said quietly, but there was a firmness in her voice. But I know one thing, you're afraid. The words, simple and calm, hit Bill harder than he could have expected. His face twisted in anger, and he took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. Afraid of you, he hissed, his voice low, almost a hiss. I don't fear you, I despise you. You think you can stand here, look at me, and say you're my equal? You're nothing. You never were and you never will be my equal. Her hands were shaking, but she looked up at him again. You can say whatever you want, she said, but it won't change who you are. Bill laughed, his laugh harsh and unpleasant. And who do you think I am? He asked, his voice full of venom. A person who lives in fear, she replied, her voice growing a little louder. A person who is afraid that the world will change. The words hit him again, but instead of stopping, he increased his onslaught. The world will change, he cried. You want to change it. I'm sorry, but this is not your world to change. You can stand here and cry and talk about equality, but you will always be behind us, always. The crowd began to murmur louder. People were openly expressing their discontent, but Bill did not notice. He was consumed by his rage, his hatred, which now turned into a desperate cry. Look at her, he continued, addressing the crowd. She wants us all to believe that she's important, but she's no different than everyone else who's destroying our country. They think we should give them everything we've got because they scream the loudest. The woman, despite his words, did not back down. Her face expressed calm, which seemed to anger Bill even more. You can scream all you want, she said, her voice quiet but powerful, but you know the truth is not on your side. These words silenced Bill for a moment. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words died in his throat. He felt his pride began to crumble under the weight of her steadfastness. You think you've won? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. You've achieved nothing, nothing. He turned to the lawyer, who stood nearby, watching the situation closely. And you too, he said, pointing a finger at him. You think your words mean anything? They don't. This is our country. This is our truth, and we will never let you take it away. The lawyer watched him silently, his face impassive. Bill turned back to the woman, his expression a mixture of hatred and despair. You will always be in your place, he said, his voice quiet, almost threatening. Remember that. But her gaze did not waver. She stood straight, despite his words, despite his hatred, and in this silent resistance, Bill felt his true weakness. The crowd began to close in on him, and he realized that he was no longer in control. His hatred, his anger, all of it had turned against him, and now he stood alone, surrounded by people who were no longer afraid to speak the truth. Bill stood in the middle of the platform, his hands shaking, his face a mixture of rage, fear and despair. The crowd around him was getting louder and louder. The condemning looks of people literally burned into him. But he did not want to stop. His hatred, which had become his only support in these minutes, screamed inside him, ordering him to continue, to scream, to blame, to humiliate. It seemed to him that if he stopped, his world would finally collapse. "You think this is your country now?" he shouted, waving his arms. His voice was shrill, as if he was trying to shout down himself. "You think you can come here, barge into our lives, into our homes, and dictate our rules? No, that won't happen." He turned sharply to the woman, who was still standing next to Jason. She had retreated, hand hidden, but her eyes were shining with suppressed tears. "And you," he continued, his voice quieter but still full of the same venom. "You think your pathetic words mean anything? You mean nothing. You're just a shadow on our streets, a reminder of how things can go wrong." Her lips trembled slightly, but she clenched her fists, not allowing herself to turn away. Her gaze did not waver, and this only provoked Bill even more. "You will always be on the sidelines," he hissed, taking a step closer. "No matter how many times you scream for equality, for justice, this is not your world. It will never be yours." The crowd around frowned. These words were spoken with such anger that even those who had been silent before now began to whisper. People looked at each other. Some took steps forward as if they wanted to say something, but they were stopped by the fear that their intervention would only make things worse. "We built this world," Bill continued, turning to the crowd. His voice was loud again, almost shouting. Not them. We were here first. We made this country great, and now they want to take it away from us. They want to destroy everything we built." "That's not true," the woman said, her voice quiet but firm. Bill fell silent, his eyes narrowed, and he turned back to her. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice threatening. "That's not true," she repeated, her hands shaking but not backing down. "You talk about fear, but it's your fear, not ours. You're afraid that we might be like you, or better." The words were like a blow. Bill recoiled for a moment, but then rushed forward again. "Better, you," he cried, his face turning crimson. "You will never be better. You will always be inferior to us. You will always be behind. That is your nature. That is all you can be." The woman, despite his words, took a step forward. Her eyes, filled with tears but burning with determination, met his gaze. "We will be equal," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it echoed across the platform like thunder. The crowd began to buzz again, louder this time. People were whispering. Some were already shouting words of support for the woman. Others were openly condemning Bill. His face was distorted in a grimace of hatred. "Equal," he cried again, his voice growing more desperate. "You will never be equal. Never." At that moment, the policeman, who had been simply watching the scene, stepped forward. His face was serious and his eyes were fixed firmly on Bill. "Mister, you need to stop," he said. His voice was firm but not aggressive. "Stop," Bill snorted, turning to the policeman. "You're on their side too. You want them to take everything we have too." "It's not their side or yours," the policeman replied. "It's the law." These words made Bill freeze. He stood in the middle of the platform, surrounded by people who looked at him with condemnation. His hands were shaking and his face was pale. He realized that he was no longer in control of the situation. His hatred, which had once been his weapon, was now his weakness. But even at that moment he could not retreat. He could not admit defeat. "You are all against me," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You are all traitors." He looked at the woman, at Jason, at the crowd around him. It felt like the whole world had turned against him, and in that moment, he knew there was nothing more he could do. His hatred, his words, his actions, they had all become his doom. Bill stood, clutching his bag as if it were the last shred of control he had left. His face was twisted with hatred, his eyes darting around the platform, searching for allies, but he saw only condemning looks. The crowd was no longer silent. People were whispering, exchanging glances, and some were starting to get outright angry. Bill tried to drown out their voices by shouting louder, taking his anger out on the woman and Jason who stood before him. But he didn't know that the real blow was yet to come. Among the passengers watching the scene was a man no one expected to see there. Standing in the shadows, slightly to the side, was Jason Statham. His face was impassive, but there was a cold, controlled fury in his eyes. He had seen it all, every humiliation, Every word of hate Bill had spewed at the woman. His strong arms were crossed over his chest, his body tense, ready for action. He knew it was time to intervene. Bill, unaware of Statham's presence, continued his tirade, his voice growing louder and his words becoming more and more vile. "You're all like that," he shouted, his face blazing with anger. "Always coming here, taking what's not yours, and then pretending to be victims. We're the real people. This is our land, our rules, and I won't let you steal it from us." The woman clenched her fists, her eyes glistening with tears, but she was no longer shaking. She knew that her fortitude was the only thing that could protect her in this moment. She took a step forward, looking straight into Bill's eyes. "You can say whatever you want," she said, her voice firm despite the trembling. "But your hatred will not make you stronger. It will only destroy you." Bill frowned for a moment, but then came to his senses. His anger flared up with renewed vigor. "Destroying me?" he cried, waving his arms. "You are the ones destroying us. You and people like you. You are the cause of all our problems." And at that moment, Jason Statham stepped forward. His gait was confident, and his gaze was focused. The crowd frowned, as if sensing the approach of something inevitable. Bill did not immediately notice him, but when Statham approached, his figure filled the entire space between Bill and the woman. "Are you done?" Jason asked calmly, his voice low but so menacing that even the crowd instinctively took a step back. Bill turned around, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and confusion. He knew who was in front of him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Who are you to interface?" he shouted, his voice shaking. "It's none of your business." Jason didn't move. His eyes pierced Bill as if he could see right through him. "It became my business when you raised your hand against that woman, when you decided that your hatred made you stronger." The crowd became even more noisy. People recognized Jason. Their whispers turned into a roar, but it didn't pay attention. All his attention was focused on Bill, who began to shift nervously from one foot to the other. "You don't know what you're talking about," Bill began, but his voice was getting quieter. "These people, they ruined everything. They don't deserve." "Deserve what?" Jason interrupted, his voice even lower. "To live, to work, to be equal. You think you can decide that?" Bill tried to find the words, but they were stuck in his throat. He felt his power slipping away. The crowd now looked at him with disdain, and the woman he had tried to humiliate stood behind Jason, her face filled with gratitude and strength. "You think your words mean anything," Jason continued, "but all they do is show how weak you are." These words, spoken calmly but with incredible force, were the final blow. Bill could no longer resist. His hands shook, and the bag he had been holding so tightly fell to the ground. The woman stepped forward and picked it up, her gaze full of dignity. "Thank you," she said to Jason. "It's not over," Bill whispered, his voice almost inaudible. "You won't win. We've already won," Jason replied, his gaze still piercing. Because truth always triumphs over hate, the crowd began to applaud. People surrounded the woman, showing their support, and Bill, broken and humiliated, stood in the center of this circle, realizing that he had lost everything. His hatred, his rage no longer had power. All he had left was the knowledge of his failure. Bill stood hunched over like a cornered animal. His eyes darted around the platform, searching for a single figure to support him, but he saw only condemnation and contempt in every look. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable a moment ago, was slowly leaking out like water from a cracked vessel. The crowd was getting closer, the roar turning into hammer blows that were pounding his fragile shell. He was still trying to maintain control, but fear was beginning to seep into his heart, causing his hands to shake and his breathing to become rapid. Jason Statham stood before him, his figure motionless as a rock. He didn't scream, didn't wave his arms, but there was a power in his calm that overwhelmed Bill. Jason looked at him as if he saw right through him, as if he knew his every weakness, his every lie, his every secret pain. That look was unbearable for Bill. "You thought you could bully a woman and get away with it," Jason said quietly, his voice low and even, but threatening. "You thought no one would stand up for her." Bill opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He tried to justify himself, but his voice was weak, almost a whisper. I didn't do anything bad," he finally squeezed out, but he didn't believe his own words. "Nothing wrong?" Jason asked, taking a step forward. His steps were slow, but each movement was like a blow. "You belittled her. You threatened her. You tried to make her feel worthless. And you called that a nothing wrong?" Bill took a step back, his back touching the cold wall. He wanted to say something again, but he couldn't. Jason kept coming closer, his gaze cold and implacable. "You tend to think that your words and your hatred make you strong," Jason said, his voice even deeper, and it made Bill's skin crawl. "But the truth is, they make you weak. They show that you're afraid of everything that's different from you." "I'm not afraid," Bill muttered, but his voice was barely audible. "You are," Jason snapped. "You're afraid of her power. You're afraid the world will change. You're afraid that she and those like her might be better than you." The words hit Bill like lightning. He felt his legs weaken, his heart beat faster. He wanted to scream, to protest, but all they could do was take another step back, pressing himself against the wall. The crowd began to close in. People were no longer just whispering. They were openly expressing their condemnation. Some were shouting words of encouragement at the woman. Others were looking at Bill with open contempt. He felt trapped, like an animal in a cage. His pride, his hatred, none of it mattered anymore. "Look at them," Jason said, waving his hand at the crowd. "You think they're on your side. You think anyone here is supporting you." Bill looked around, his eyes darting from one face to another, but all he saw was condemnation. Even those who had been silent before were now looking at him as if he were dirty, unworthy of their attention. He felt a cold sweat begin to trickle down his back. "You're alone, Bill," Jason continued, his voice softer, but there was more menace in that softness. "And it's always been like that. You hid behind your hatred, behind your words, but now everyone sees you for who you really are." These words made Bill shake. His hands, still clutching the empty bag, shook like autumn leaves. His breathing became heavy and his eyes were full of panic. He could no longer hide behind his aggression, no longer use his hatred as a weapon. I just wanted things to stay the way they were," he whispered, his voice weak, like a small child who realized he had made a mistake. "Times change," Jason said. His voice was firm, but there was something human in it. "And you should have known that, but you chose hate. You chose to humiliate others so you could feel strong, and now you're alone." The crowd began to applaud. People surrounded the woman, supporting her, hugging her, expressing their admiration for her resilience. Bill stood to the side, broken, with a blank look in his eyes. He was no longer the loud, confident man who shouted his superiority. Now he was just a small man, lost in his own fear. Jason turned to the woman and smiled softly. "You are strong," he said, "and you have proven it." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears again, but they were tears of relief. She knew this moment would change everything, and Bill, alone in the crowd, knew his world would never be the same again. Bill Saturday in his dark apartment, surrounded by a ringing silence. His once familiar world, where he felt strong and confident, had become a cage created by his own words and actions. The curtains were tightly drawn, but even through them he could hear the voices from the street. They did not stop, condemning shouts, the roar of the crowd, sometimes even a knock on his door. He could no longer go outside, could not look people in the eye. The world around him had become hostile, and his name had become a symbol of hatred. It seemed to him that even the walls were pressing in on him, reflecting his own fear and despair. The news was full of the incident every day. The woman he had humiliated became a heroine. Her story spread throughout the city and then beyond. People admired her resilience, her ability to stand up to hatred and not break. Not only did she regain her dignity, but she became a symbol of the fight against injustice. Her interviews were broadcast on all channels. She spoke calmly, without malice, but her words left a deep mark. "I don't hold a grudge against him," she said in one of her interviews, her voice soft but determined. "Hatred destroys not only those it is directed at, but also those who carry it. This is a lesson for all of us. We must be stronger, but not through hatred, through kindness and truth." The words were like a death sentence for Bill. He heard them on TV, over and over again. They burned him inside. She could have hated him, could have used this situation to humiliate him, but instead she rose above. Her generosity was a more painful blow than any condemning words. The police concluded their investigation and Bill was charged. In addition to humiliation and aggression, his actions were considered a public nuisance. The lawyers defending the woman demanded compensation for moral damages. He knew he had neither the resources nor the ability to fight this. All his connections turned against him. People who used to share his views now kept silent, afraid of being associated with him. His name became toxic. Every day his fear only grew. He could not sleep at night. In every rustle they heard footsteps, In every sound voices of condemnation. He knew that he deserved it, but he could not cope with this realization. It seemed to him that he was drowning in his own hatred, which was now turned against him. Meanwhile, the woman's life began to change. She received support from many people. Her children, who had previously seen her fighting justice alone, were now proud of her. Her neighbors, who had once ignored her, now helped and supported her. She became stronger. Her words inspired thousands of people to fight for their right to be heard. And in this situation, Bill found himself completely isolated. His hatred no longer had power. His words, which he considered weapons, turned against him. All they had left were the memories of the moment when he lost everything. He realized what he had done, but it was too late. One day he tried to go out. It was early in the morning, when the city was just beginning to wake up. He thought he could pass unnoticed, but even then, people recognized him. Their glances, their whispers, all of it told him that his past would never leave him again. It's him. He heard the voice of a woman standing near the cafe. It's that same Bill. He quickened his pace, keeping his head down, but he had nowhere to go. His fear was his only companion. He realized he could no longer hide. His isolation was not physical. It was inside him. His own actions had created a cage from which there was no escape. And the woman he tried to harm continued to live. She became an example of how goodness and justice can overcome hatred. Her story changed the lives of many people. She showed that strength is not in hatred, but in the ability to remain human even in the most difficult situations. And this victory was real justice. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? If so, share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. We want to hear your voice. Your support and stories help us create a space where everyone can be heard and understood. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. You are our inspiring audience, and your opinions are incredibly important to us. If this story touched you or gave you food for thought, please don't forget to subscribe and like the channel. It helps us continue to tell such important stories. We wish you a good and peaceful day. Thank you for being with us.